chose to look at water pollution in China and how it's affecting their rice production.
So rice in China is obviously very important. They're responsible in the past for producing 90% of the world's rice supply. China's population consumes about 90 kgs of rice per year per person, making them one of the top consumers of rice. One interesting fact about Chinese rice is it's grown by 150 million small farmers, and that only 2% of that, in addition, is grown by state-run production farms. Cadmium and arsenic are our main focus, and these contaminants come from old zinc mines, which have been improperly closed down and then leached into the water sources because of the shrinking land masses. Many farms are opening up right outside the zinc mines and sometimes even right on top of them. The second one is improper agriculture practices. There's a lot of use of the sludge that is surrounding a lot of farms that even though they wouldn't necessarily normally use it, they got this into their idea that this was a source of fertilizer, and so they use that as well, just because of poor education. And finally, factories. A lot of factories have been known to dump sludge directly right into the waterways. One particular peasant farmer actually watched and took pictures for a couple of months of a farmer doing this, brought him to the government, and then found himself jailed. So the government has been pretty good at not necessarily denying the problem, but not necessarily fully acknowledging it either. 1/5 of land is contaminated with heavy metals, and keep in mind that this is only what's reported by the government. The government, like I said, has been sort of in denial of this problem. And the two that we're going to focus on are arsenic and cadmium, which is estimated to be responsible for a decrease of 10 million tons of food supplies each year.
So who is regulating this Chinese government? You have the Environmental Protection Ministry, who normally would create regulation preventing pollution and supervising waste production. So what they are trying to do, and not yet have implemented, was to utilize U.S. expertise to create sort of a similar Clean Water Action Plan that's similar to the Clean Water Acts that the U.S. has produced. Ideally, it would produce technologies and policies that would limit waste production. However, this action has not been implemented fully within the Chinese government, and it really hasn't been a huge or hasn't had a huge impact on the waste production so far. They want to fully implement it by 2013, but it does not look like that goal will be met. So current problems within Chinese policy would be that the rural areas are very scattered, and regulation of these areas and enforcement of the regulation is very hard for the Chinese government to do, just simply because there's so many of these small farms, and it's hard to get people out within each of these communities testing the soil for cadmium and pollution, etc. There are currently around 50 laws and regulations that are preventative within soil pollution, water pollution, etc. But the problem, again, is regulation. There's really lack of definitive wastewater policy. The system does not work. It's really just, there's no way that they can regulate the pollution and outflow from these mines and factories. Additionally, there's a huge lack of transparency within the government. The issue is the government does not really, they do acknowledge that there's a problem, they do not produce studies and information on the problem, they don't educate their citizens, and they do not really cooperate very well with universities and health institutes that are conducting their own studies. So it's hard for anybody to get anywhere where the government is not really cooperating well.
Yeah, so to kind of tie in what we've been talking about to terms you talked about in class, like Tony was talking about, there appears to be a lot of regulations in place, and the Chinese federal government seems to do a lot of policies that would affect the rural farmers in some kind of way to change their practices. But even though there's all these policies in place, this lack of enforcement, on a rural level, on an urban level, there might be more enforcement, but well, there's definitely more enforcement compared to on the rural level. And a lot of this has, kind of ties back to Ostrom and her principles when regulating the common resource and how to successfully live in a common resource where there's a common resource and proliferate and not harm the environment. In rural China, most of these places go unregulated, and of course when there's no regulation, the individual factory owners, they act in a highly self-interested way. So for the most part, like you see here, this is a picture of the Yangtze River, and Tony was just talking about how a lot of these factories just dump their waste into the river, and this is their plastic factory. And they have no problem just dumping their waste into the rivers and other bodies of water because there are no sanctions that are implemented there. There's no credibility, there's no accountability to these factory owners and small farm owners in these rural areas. So essentially, because there's a lack of congruence between rural areas and the federal government, there causes an implementation gap, which, in general terms, is just on a federal level, there are policies that are passed and regulations that are implemented, but they just aren't getting down to the rural levels to really have any effect. So without sanctions, everyone operates for their greatest benefit. And we talked about this with Hardy talked about it, and Ashton talked about this a lot. Without any regulation, without any responsibility, everyone's going to adhere to practices that gain them the most benefit without looking at the overall negative effect on the environment, which is what we're facing today. Also ties into the water pollution in rural China with the rice is a double movement described by Carl Polanyi, which is essentially a pendulum between social protection and economic liberalism. And so, historically, all these rural areas have been operating under economic liberalism with very little regulation and very little standards of their practices. But now, there's a lot more, there's increasing credibility to these rural Chinese farmers, and it's moving towards enforced legislative regulation, which is the main part. It's about enforcing regulation, not necessarily just passing them. And a major reason why they aren't being implemented and being enforced is because these local Chinese farmers are closely related, have close relationships with political power, political power in their areas, who tend to ignore their environmental and their regulation, discrepancies and lack of adherence to them. So I guess, a major part that has to be a part of this for the double movement, I guess, in Polanyi's his writing to be enforced is they turn to act as increased responsibility to impose such legislation. And I guess once this happens, then we can see that this implementation gap that we're noticing today will probably, it will diminish to the point where local and rural farmers are following and adhering to the rules passed on federal levels and on more local and less, being and not necessarily being allowed to follow these practices that are hurting the environment in the long term and ignoring regulations which are actually in place but just not being followed.
So, in trying to think about a solution, we noticed that there are a couple of things going on. First of all, in terms of China specifically, they have a very centralized government, and so we thought that with the government the way it is, it needs to homogenize the rules so that it applies everywhere. So, because a lot of the problem is that since there are different laws in different areas, or not necessarily different laws, but not knowing how to go about disposing properly of waste, they needed to work harder at ensuring that there's an equal level of knowledge about how to dispose of the waste properly. But they also need to incorporate polycentric elements into that. So, maybe have, since the problem occurs in rural areas, have more places where testing would occur and education of farmers could prevent the pollution from getting into the rice. And so when we started to talk about solutions, how do we go about, we looked at 4 different things. One is the inventory, where are we? 2, goal setting. 3, strategic planning, and 4, evaluation.
So in the advent of time, I'm going to briefly explain a couple of key points that we wanted to focus upon. Certainly taking an inventory of